dies, it's not denied that he dies, and dies in the same way that his people died, but then rises again and creates a new basis for community for them, a kind of community that can survive even their being scattered around the entire Roman Empire, would be a functional myth. It's really quite astonishing to believe that for no reason at all, Jews, and after all, the New Testament was written entirely by Jews, and all the first Christians were Jewish, would have told a story in which their God dies, in which he can no longer do anything for them. But under the impact of great trauma, bold kinds of creativity sometimes receive a new license. Now let me move to my third point, and that is to return to Orwell and to the question of art and propaganda in a more general way. Remember that Orwell aspired first to be a novelist. He was torn between fiction and nonfiction. He finally left fiction, I believe, because he was uncomfortable with the ambiguity that is a virtual necessity in fiction. Great novels are not admired if they are rigidly didactic. And the habit of simultaneously entertaining two contradictory ideas, which is the doublethink that is fatal in politics, is virtually the condition for greatness in literary art. I think, for example, of the famous final words of Samuel Beckett's novel, The Unnameable. I can't go on, I'll go on. Or of the final line in a work of a kind of romantic or literary philosophy, Albert Camus' The Rebel. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Sisyphus is in hell, but we must imagine him in heaven. Another kind of contradiction. And let me read to you the closing lines of a poem that was entering British consciousness around the time that Orwell was writing Down and Out in Paris and London. The poem ends with a Latin proverb which means, "Sweet it is and fair to die for one's country." If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. That's by Wilfred Owen. And it has a kind of hidden contradiction in it, because Wilfred Owen seems to be writing an anti-war poem. He seems to be writing a poem against political propaganda, but he was a patriot. And he died fighting in the same war a short time after he wrote that poem. Now, these contradictions are honored as art. So does that mean then that there is no such thing as propaganda, that there's nothing really here to oppose? On the contrary, there very clearly is. And what I want to suggest as the moral, if you will, of my brief opening remarks here is that religion, art, and propaganda always overlap, but each of the three has its own distinct norms. And we get in trouble when we allow the norms of one to govern the activities of the other. We want, surely, a president with the capacity to entertain competing ideas, but we want him at a certain point to come down clearly for one and not attempt to hold both at the same time. We don't want to hear someday in a speech from the White House, we can't go to war with Iran, we'll go to war. That would be an inappropriate introduction of the norms of art into the activities of government. Similarly, I would say the counsel that religion ought to take itself from a triple consideration like this one is that it is at its strongest when it hews closer to the poetic than to the philosophical, much less the political. Ignatius Loyola wrote a set of rules for thinking with the church, one of which is that if the hierarchy says something is black and my eyes tell me that it's white, I'll believe the hierarchy. It's like Chico Marx, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? That is not poetry. Take and Eat, This Is My Body is a kind of very daring poetry written in response to a catastrophic situation. So long as these distinctions are kept in mind, I think it will be possible to employ art even in the service of activities that are not artistic and to allow propaganda its legitimate place, but nothing more. Thank you.
So next we're going to hear from Masha Gessen, who is Russian-born, written a number of books, including Dead Again, The Russian Intelligentsia, and she's currently a reporter in Moscow writing for a variety of publications. Masha?
Thank you. So you remember Soviet propaganda. Soviet propaganda rested on a dual message, a message of fear and a message of reassurance. The message of fear was that it was a very scary world. We were surrounded by enemies, but the message of reassurance was that we had the might to confront it. And the reassurance was offered so long as one did not relax, so long as one did one's part. This poster asks, have you filled your food supplies? Similar posters asked, have you signed up as a volunteer, etc. Soviet propaganda worked so well that it continued to work by providing comfort even after Soviet ideology ceased to exist in the 70s and 80s. And it continued to work even when the Soviet Union ceased to exist in the 90s. It never really went away. In the early 90s, I worked at a newspaper in Moscow that, in place of a style manual, circulated a sheet of a list of Soviet expressions and words that could not be used because they were so discredited. And a lot of the new mass media circulated similar crib sheets for their staff, but out in the real world, or rather on the air, the new style that they were trying to invent bumped up against Soviet movies that continued to be broadcast on Russian television, and that in that scary and alienating era provided oases of safety and a common aesthetic. In all that time, no new public language appeared. And so in '96, when Boris Yeltsin was up for re-election, his people reached for fear and anxiety, the old standbys. This is the front page of a newspaper that was circulated in 1996. The newspaper is called God Forbid, and the entire newspaper was devoted to what might happen if the communists came back to power. It detailed all the horrible things, and it worked by inspiring fear that unites people. So fear unites people, anxiety moves people to act on their emotions, which is exactly what Yeltsin's people implored people to do. This is an election poster that says, choose with your heart. That was the message, and it worked very well. Yeltsin's popularity rating recovered from the single digits to allow him to win the election. And fear and anxiety returned to reclaim their places as the main motivators in politics. Nowhere was this more noticeable in the late 1990s than in advertising. Following the '96 election, a wave of nostalgia swept through Russian advertising, kicking imported products off of store shelves and replacing them with nostalgia products. This is Doktorskaya kolbasa, the fattiest bologna known to man. This was invented in the 1930s as treatment for malnutrition that resulted, as the advertising literature of the 1930s claimed, from the after effects of